Hello YouTube. It's your boy Dante with another optimization guide. Today we will be covering the latest installment of the Trails series RPG called Legend of Heroes, Trails Through Daybreak. I will be showing you how to optimize each settings in the graphics menu, what they actually do, comparison of each setting and how much performance they cost. That way you can decide for yourself which setting suits you the best according to your hardware. Along with all of that, I will also be showing you my recommended settings as well. Just to inform, I will be using an RTX 3060 Ti on 1440p resolution at unlocked frame rate for this guide. With that out of the way, let's get started. When you come to the graphics section in the graphics tab, the first three settings are pretty straightforward and we will not be discussing those, as everyone knows what they are for. We will be starting from motion blur. Now if you are not familiar to this, motion blur is an effect that blurs fast-moving objects on the screen. Notice the orange/brown texture on the lower part of this food stand right here. When I stop the camera, the texture is clearly visible, but when I move the camera, it is blurred out. It is totally up to your preference whether you want to keep motion blur on or off, as this does not cost any performance at all. Next is depth of field. This effect is used to blur out objects that are far from the screen just to give that cinematic look. In this game, depth of field only activates in cutscenes and not during normal play. Notice the characters and background objects getting blurred in this cutscene? That is depth of field. Decide this setting also upon your personal preference, as this one also costs no FPS at all. Next is character draw distance. Like the name states, what this does is control how far characters are rendered in-game. Characters in this game means NPCs and enemy/monsters. When we compare each setting, we can see that high and even medium loads characters very far away from screen. Notice the woman on the bridge standing at almost non-noticeable distance? That is high setting, not ultra. Even in medium, you can see the woman disappeared, but this man is still visible, that is very far away from screen. If you switch to low, then you can actually see some noticeable difference, as people from the food stalls are not visible anymore and only NPCs near to you are now visible. Performance-wise, even here the FPS cost was so low that I had to switch to 1080p to actually see the difference. On both Ultra and High, I was getting 121 frames per second. On Medium it was 122, and on Low it was 124. Here, I recommend High setting, as the draw distance it offers is more than enough. Next we have level of detail. What this setting does, is control how far objects are rendered in the game. When in comparison, Low and Medium gave same results. Same can be said for High and Ultra, by only making some minor objects visible very far, like these benches here. Performance-wise the story was the same. Low and Medium had same performance. On the other hand, High and Ultra cost just 3 FPS with same performance cost. Since the FPS cost was so low at such a high frame rate, would again recommend high settings here. Next is light draw distance. What this setting does, is control how far light sources light up the environment. This is the first setting in which there was a lot of difference between high and ultra. As you can see, lights at the end of tunnel don't light up the area in high setting. At medium setting, we only see one more light source here lose light, while in low setting, only this one near us is giving out light. This setting was not taxing at all, and going from low to ultra only cost me 2 FPS. Here, because of the visual difference, would recommend ultra setting. Now we get to the first performance costing setting, which is shadow resolution. Like the name says, this one controls the resolution of shadows in-game. Ultra, as expected, has high resolution crisp looking shadows. High also has good shadows, but you can see a small compromise in shadows from thin objects like here. Medium settings makes all shadows look very blurry because of low resolution, and in low, the shadows from thin objects almost becomes invisible and overall looks bad. Performance-wise, going from ultra to high, FPS went up from 75 to 79, while medium and low gave 81 and 82 FPS respectively. Now you must be thinking, the difference from low to ultra is only 7 frames per second. The thing is, we are at 1440p resolution here. On 1080p and especially on lower hardware, the difference will be almost double of this. I would recommend high shadows, but if you want more performance, you can use to medium. The next setting is shadow filtering. In this setting you select different rendering techniques of shadows. The highest setting, PCSS, simulates an effect that softens shadows depending on how far they are coming from. Notice the softer shadows here from the railing above? That is because its source is far from it. In comparison, our character's shadow or these shadows here are crisp, because its source is close by or directly on top of it. Here is another example of this, where the building roof far from here exhibits soft shadow, while the balcony being right on top of here produces hard-looking one. Soft shadows just makes every shadow soft, but I think the softness is way too much here and does not look good. The default and basic setting both look the same, and tries to simulate PCSS-like effect, with some shadows a little softer like here, but the technique is not accurate. Still, they look far better than soft setting. Performance-wise, going from PCSS to soft, gives a benefit of 4 FPS. From there we get another 4 FPS increase at both default and basic setting. Since the high cost of 8 FPS, I recommend default shadow filtering in this game, but if you have more performance headroom, you can use PCSS. Shadow caching is next. This is basically the method of how shadows are cached into your RAM. Visually there is no difference between off and default setting, but switching to aggressive will cost you some shadow detail like shown here. Performance-wise, aggressive and default had no FPS cost, but off cost 10 FPS more. Here I recommend default setting. Next is local shadow. What this does is apply ambient occlusion to the game. Ambient occlusion is a graphical technique that applies shadows or darkens different parts of an object, depending upon where the light is coming from. These wooden boxes and their near objects, on Ultra, are a good example of ambient occlusion. You can see that when compared to other settings, the lower ones lack depth while the lowest setting looks very flat. Performance-wise, going from Ultra to High is a massive boost in performance. That is because the Ultra settings, like stated here, uses some form of custom ray-traced ambient occlusion. The difference between low and high is not very big. Here I recommend high setting, but medium is also acceptable if you want more performance. Rendering scale is a very straightforward setting which increases or decreases the resolution, depending on this slider. Your actual resolution after the selection on the slider is shown right below. Next is anti-aliasing. What this technique do is try to eliminate jagged edges of literally everything in the game. Let's first talk about settings from off to high. When we compare high with default, we can see more jaggedness all over the screen on default setting. Setting it to off completely disables anti-aliasing, making everything looks even more jagged. This setting does not cost much FPS, as the difference between high to off is just 2 FPS. Now let's talk about the higher AA settings, that is MSAA. This setting has even more sub-settings tied to in graphics menu. MSAA is a far more advanced AA method which looks better and sharper than FXAA, which was at high settings, but the performance cost is high. Going from high to X2 MSAA, I went down from 76 FPS to 70. At X4 MSAA it went even lower to 65 FPS, and in X8 MSAA to 60 FPS. For anti-aliasing, I recommend high settings for entry-level graphics cards. For better hardware I would not recommend anything above X4 MSAA. Now let's come to its sub-setting, that is sparse grid supersampling, or in short SGSSAA. This is a super aggressive method of AA, which look even better of course, but the performance costs are massive. From 76 FPS, my FPS came down to 50 FPS, and on everything setting, it came down to 45 FPS, making it unplayable for me. The recommendation here is everything plus X2 MSAA, but keep in mind that is only for the powerful hardware. The next two settings, Transparency Multisampling and Portrait Super Sampling, seems to be broken in this game and does nothing at all. Transparency Multisampling is supposed to apply AA on reflective surfaces, like this car here, but both on and off looks the same. Portrait Super Sampling also seems to have no effect at all, and the image looks exactly the same on every setting. Even performance-wise, turning off both these settings together, affected in no performance increase at all. So here I recommend off for both these settings. Minimap Anti-Aliasing only applies on the jagged lines of the minimap in-game. When compared, you can see that minimap at X8 MSAA has no jaggedness, while off has jagged lines everywhere. Here I recommend X8 MSAA, as this does not cost any performance because of being applied on such a minor part of the image. Next is Anisotropic Filtering. What this does is keep intact the texture detail of ground surface at a distance, while being viewed from an angle like this. When compared, you can see that in default setting, ground textures are blurred at a distance, while high and maximum have the texture details intact. This setting does not cost any performance, but I still recommend high, as it is enough to cover all the faraway ground textures. Next is Screen Space Reflections. This setting is used to control the quality of reflections on a reflective surface, like this water surface here. The higher the setting, the better the reflection. On the other hand, off completely disables screen space reflections. Performance-wise on this scene, on Ultra I was getting 80 FPS, on high 83 FPS, on default 86 FPS and on off 87 FPS. Here I recommend default setting, but you can choose high, if you have some performance headroom. Next is High Resolution Cube Map. This method just helps in getting high resolution reflections on reflective surfaces, like this one here. Performance-wise on and off were the same. Here I recommend on, for this setting. Next is Volumetric Lighting, which is a very taxing setting. This applies lighting on the game depending on the scene. For example, in this case, the blue light from the sky is scattered throughout the scene here, with overall image getting a blue tint. This setting also applies bloom on different light sources and objects, like this recovery point losing its bloom on off setting. Another example of bloom is this light at the back, the headlights of this car, and also these leaves here. Performance-wise, on Ultra it gave 76 FPS, on high 83 FPS, on default 85 FPS, on low 86 FPS and on off 89 FPS. Here I recommend low, because of almost no visual difference between low and ultra settings. The last one, water shading, is another setting that seemed to have no effect, and the performance was also the same on both original and modern setting. Here I recommend modern, just to be on the safe side. That concludes the graphic settings optimization. Now let's look at the difference between Ultra and my recommended settings. With almost no visual difference, recommended ran at 118 FPS while Ultra ran at the usual 76 FPS, which we witnessed throughout the optimization process. And this brings us the end of the guide. If this video helped you, kindly leave a like and support the channel by subscribing. Good luck, and happy gaming!